Like, we're going to be talking to your window.
Yeah.
Hi.
That's funny. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. This is the 15th NiCHE conversation of season 3. And I'm Jessica DeWitt, one of the editors here at the network in Canadian History and Environment. And today I am joined by Sarah York-Bertram. Do you want to introduce yourself to us?
Sure, yeah. So my name is Sarah York-Bertram, as Jessica has said, and I'm a PhD candidate at York University in Gender, Feminist, and Women's Studies. And I'm very excited to be here today to talk about our co-edited series on emotional ecologies.
Yes. And Sarah and I have known each other for a long time, but I think this is the first series that we've edited, a written thing that we've edited. We've done lots of collaborations, but we haven't done something quite like this. And we brought our two specialties together. So I'm the environmental historian in this duo, and Sarah, as we're going to talk about, is more on the emotion side of things. So first off, I'd like to talk about, what is your background in affect theory and the history of emotion?
Yeah, so hold on to your hat, because it's a fairly long tail. I've been at this for a while. So it started with a minor focus on psychology and its history, and a major in women's and gender studies, which involved a lot of queer and feminist affect theory. Professor T.L. Cowan joined my program at the University of Saskatchewan in my final year of my undergrad, and she introduced me to Anne Cvetkovich's work, An Archive of Feelings, which I would say is probably my first introduction to feminist and queer affect theory. Around the same time, I connected with sex work activist and porn star Annie Sprinkle in New York City, and she and her partner Beth Stevens held these gorgeous, campy, joyful, ecosexual, and biophilic weddings in which they would marry things like mountains. Yeah. So a colleague of mine from Aid Saskatoon, which is now Prairie Harm Reduction, Harley Moorman, was involved in Annie and Beth's events. So it was just this really joyful and hopeful time in global movement, and I think that would probably be my first kind of introduction to queer emotional ecologies. But it wasn't until my graduate studies, and particularly my doctoral program, that I really got to sink my teeth into advanced feminist theory in a course instructed by Professor Eva Karpinski, who has been a member of my various committees throughout my PhD program. So in Professor Karpinski's course, we spent a lot of time grappling with subject-object relations and feminist epistemologies. We read works by Claire Hemmings and Robin Wigman and Sarah Ahmed, among many, many others. And around the same time, I was introduced to the history of emotion subfield by Professor Mark Stein. And that was in a history of sexuality course. So Professor Stein included Deborah Gold's work, Moving Politics, which is about the history of emotions in ACT UP's fight against HIV/AIDS. And in that, Gold draws from Bourdieu's theory of habitus to theorize something that Gold terms emotional habitus. So over the years, I've learned that there are many different methodologies and interpretations of affect theory and the subfield of the history of emotions. the way that Gold explained it, that I found very accessible, was that like affect would be understood as the pre-cultural, pre-linguistic first step in an emotional process.
Mm.
And then feminist theorist Alison Jagger, in her exploration of modern Western philosophy's reason, emotion binary, demonstrates how language and culture bring affect into the social realm. So there's a process, and a lot of the history of emotions engages with process. But I would say that one of the things most recently, I think, is most important to keep in mind is that it's represented, like the subfield of the history of emotions is often represented as something new, but it's actually not.
Yeah.
So now when I'm introducing the subfield, like I did during the Canadian Historical Association convening during Congress a few weeks ago at York University, I like to point to Professor Sarah Hunt's work. There's a really well-known and referenced TED Talk that Professor Hunt did that's titled "In Her Name, Relationship as Law." And Professor Hunt is the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Political Ecology at the University of Victoria. And in the talk, she challenges Canadian settler colonial law by reminding us that despite Canada's attempt to make Indigenous peoples in what is currently called Canada into a monolithic group with the Indian Act, Indigenous peoples are, and I'm going to quote here, a diverse people with diverse communities, each with our own cultural practices, ceremonial practices, and laws that governed our lives for thousands of years and taught us how to live with one another and to live in relationship with the land and the animals around us. Underneath the laws of Canada, these Indigenous laws are still alive and active in our relationships with the land and with one another. They've never gone away. And so I point to Hunt's work and interventions to demonstrate for largely white and settler audiences that though a lot of white scholars say the history of emotions is a new subfield that's just becoming more and more popular, in the Canadian context, a lot of its foundational frameworks and its emphasis on relationality, like we're exploring in the series, is not new. And part of my responsibility as a knowledge producer is to resist this kind of Columbusing of these approaches for neoliberalism and neocolonialism. So I also like to draw links between this subfield and its methods and the concept of cognitive justice, which is a term made popular by Indian scholar Shiv Visvanathan. And that's based on the principle that all knowledges should coexist in a dialogic relationship to each other. And I like that these areas of research and these approaches aren't really interested in universal truths or experiences, universal experiences, or even in settling arguments or disputes. Instead, they're interested in process, and they ask after the terms which relationships occur and recur. So it's a different approach than most Western knowledges in that it's not interested in universalizing any experience at all. It's interested in diversity of experiences.
Cool. Yeah. No, it's all like very new to me because I haven't read many of these scholars. And in my own work, emotion comes up and I wanted to explore it more. But like it comes up a lot in sensory history, like sensory issues with parks and like the way that people relate to park lands, and the idea of a park is often very emotional, right?
Yeah.
And they have emotional reactions to certain activities in parks. Like they'll have emotional reactions to people who aren't acting right in parks.
Right.
They'll have emotional reactions to logging happening in parks because that's not what parks are for. Or they'll just have an emotional reaction to the fact that they know it's happening. Like it's not that it's happening, it's that it's like bothering them, right? And it's eliciting emotion and annoyance and that sort of thing. And yeah, but I've never had the time yet to really sit with these theorists and these ideas. And when you invited me to do this series, I was like, ooh, yes, because it like really gets me like I'm being introduced to a lot of ideas for the first time, or it really invites us to look at environmental issues from like a really different lens than we sometimes do. So I was really excited when you approached me, but like why were you interested in exploring emotional ecologies? Like why, and is it because it's relevant to today or what have you?
Yeah, well, I think like what I'd like to do to answer that question is like point to the kind of current discourse and taking up of the orcas who are damaging rudders on boats. So I feel like that's a really good example of why emotional ecologies is relevant at this time. So there's been a lot of cultural production around the orcas damaging or destroying the rudders, and people have been taking it up as like symbolic of resistance, which I love. I love that. But I also think it's important to be curious about what we're projecting onto these gorgeous and brilliant mammals. And I think that attending to emotional ecologies is one way of exploring that curiosity. So some have warned not to project our own emotional frameworks onto non-human animals, like the notion that orcas are vengeful. But others have pointed to the possibility of trauma as a factor influencing the behavior that the orcas are damaging the rudders, because rudders have hurt them or members of their pod, and they don't want other orcas to be injured by rudders. And still others have even proposed the possibility that it's play. And that's what's informing the behavior. And we know orcas love to play, sometimes with their food in ways that disturb humans. So this idea of play kind of makes me think about Eric Zimmerman's Manifesto for a Ludic Century. So Eric Zimmerman in game studies proposed this manifesto of the current century being one of play. And that kind of gets also to start thinking about, I think, like the first line that Zimmerman proposes in the manifesto or writes in the manifesto is, games are ancient. And by factoring in non-human animal behavior, like maybe we can grasp how play is integral to experience on this planet. So attending to emotional ecologies can get us thinking about these relations and whether it's more than human on their own terms, which would be amazing, especially considering how integral that is to survival at the end of the Anthropocene. But also thinking about our relationship with animals and the thing, or the environment, I think is highly relevant right now, but it always has been. That's my answer.
Yes. Yeah. The whole orca thing has actually made me like very uncomfortable. And I always, first of all, I always take issue with the idea that we can't, like, that humans are so separate from other animals that we couldn't possibly understand what they're feeling. To me, that like introduces like an alienation and a different and an othering that is not based in reality and is a little bit of like a humans are not part of nature sort of thing. And that it suggests that we can't be in tune with our natural surroundings and the beings that we share it with. So I always take issue with that idea that we couldn't possibly. But at the same time, there's a projection onto these orcas that is making me uncomfortable, and I haven't really completely dealt with that yet. And the idea that it might be trauma, but it might be play, and it's like, yeah, I don't know. I just like
or
both. Yeah, we all know that we've all done things, you know.
Like how disturbing is the game Settlers of Catan? Like honestly, there's trauma there. Like
yeah, or
you
like the things that you like, you know, things in my past, you know, I had a bit too much to drink and I did some stupid things that probably were like trauma informed at the time, right? So but we're play in the moment, you know.
That's such a good point. That play in itself is not like some sort of innocent thing that's devoid of like all of the context around it. Like it can be trauma and it can be play at the same time.
Yeah. Anyways, I've just been sitting with that, and I haven't really figured out why I'm uncomfortable with the I guess I also just get really uncomfortable when humans are like hyper fixated on any animals, because
it's usually not good news for the animals.
Usually not good news for the animals. Because we don't know how to just, and this is a very, very hyper generalization, but like maybe like Western culture and the way that we use media, we don't know how to just like be in relation with these species. We have to make it into like a thing. And it has to be a thing before people pay attention, and then the thing, I don't know, goes out of control, and isn't, it becomes about us and not about them, right? Anyways, so that has to say that that's a really good example, and one that I've been thinking about. And I think we also like came across some stuff right before we put out the call for papers about, you know, how like whale watching is actually very stressful for the whales involved. And what is the point at which we call an end to these kind of like ecotourism things that cause stress to these animals that we're supposedly like taking in and appreciating, right? But we're actually causing them harm. And, you know, when do we take their emotions into account over our own, etc.? Yeah.
And I would love to see emotional ecologies as a like generative space for thinking about centering animal experience. But I would say that that's probably not how most people, like a lot of people engage with it more in the human-centered way, which makes a lot of sense, all things considered. But yeah, I think that there is a lot of potential for centering more of the animal experience of reality, and learning about that. And also, like when I think about what you're saying about, you know, ecotourism and the effects that has on the animals, and a lot of times I've heard people say like it's integral to education or to getting people to care about animals. And I think that in our introduction we talked about, oh goodness, I forget the theorist's name, but the concept of care and kind of exploring care for animals and in relationship with the non-human world is, I think, like very integral to scholarship moving forward. That's, yeah, I wish I could remember their name, but people will have to go back to the introduction and read it.
Yeah. And it's important to note that there has been a lot of movement in like emotional ecology amongst historians and other scholars as of late. Andy Flack, who is in the audience, is one of those scholars. And, you know, this series is kind of like just inviting. We just wanted to invite folks, like, we wanted to see what people were doing, right? This is what I love about NiCHE series, is that you can put out a call on a basic topic and just see like the breadth of topics and experiences, etc., that are going on out there.
Yeah.
And we ended up getting, what was it, 34 submissions or something?
It was a lot.
It was enough that
yeah.
we could have had this series going for 5 months, twice a week, right?
Yeah.
And we wanted to accept everyone, but we ended up cutting it down to 12, and we're halfway through now. I think we've published 7.
Yeah.
So like, what do you think people, like, if readers that are approaching this series, what do you think they'll get out of it?
That's a good question. There's a diversity in approaches, and, you know, like thinking about what we have so far and what's coming up, like there's like readers can expect features on like particular people and literature and concepts. And I hate to like be an editor that's like my favorite, but one of my favorites is the narratives that are like first person and kind of exploring emotional ecologies. And I think that's funny that I'm like, what I really like is this, because I literally just said that there's so much focus on like the human-centered experience and emotional ecologies some of the time, but I really love it. And the pieces that we have published so far that are quite first person narratives. And then we also upcoming have collaborative projects that are going to be published as well. So I would say that readers can expect to see kind of a variation in approaches and like different ways about thinking about emotional ecologies, whether it is from a first-person narrative, whether it's from like epistemological explanations or ontological explanations. We picked a very kind of diverse cast of pieces to share with people. But do you have anything to add, or can I ask you any questions? You know, you're like a veteran editor here, so I'm going to take the opportunity. So where do you see our co-edited series in conversation with other niche features?
Okay. Well, firstly, I think there is, I have spearheaded, and other editors, and I think the scholarly community in general is embracing queerness and sexuality more explicitly, and I've seen that coming out in this series in relation, and I really love that. When I published Succession: Queering the Environment, my first queer series in 2020, so that's only 3 years ago, we only had one piece on the NiCHE website prior that had anything to do with queerness. And now we are getting submissions for almost all of our series. And I think that's really awesome. And I think that emotions is a really beautiful place to approach queerness and the environment. There's so much, you know, external pressure on the natural. But I think that, you know, like in Andy Schwartz's piece, we see like how, you know, being in a relationship with a tree really opened her ideas, like opened her mind to her queerness as a young a young person. And, Jose was talking about, indigenous knowledge and indigenous ideas around emotion and sexuality, and the environment, and how they groups in the Amazon view natural spaces as being embodied places, right? Their bodies, their sexual beings. And just like this is just playing off of like, growing, I think, I don't know if it's like comfort. I'm not really sure what it is in that we've seen an increase in I don't know if it's because the editors at NiCHE are more open to it. Like, it's me and other editors who like actually look at these topics. I don't know if it's just that in general academia is just getting more comfortable with them. It's just it's interesting. Yeah. And I also just love that we have scholars from everywhere, which is just like something that we've seen on NiCHE in the last several years, as we used to just be a Canada only blog, 10 years ago, and we had the same 10 environmental historians writing for us 3 times a year.
Yeah.
And now we're seeing scholarship from all over, and it enriches things so much. And it's just really fun. And it's beautiful to be in conversation with people from all over, because there's ways that we're not that different after all. It's quite cliche, but it's true, right? And kind of like we've talked about it on the editorial, both like these when we started to grow and get more global in focus, like an uncomfortableness a bit, because we're like, oh, we're niche, like Canada, and we still focus on Canada, but like just having the opportunity to challenge this idea that these modern state boundaries are what define us, like that's the like Canada only, and anything else is not relevant, and it just isn't true, right? Like we're all it only serves to enrich scholarship and enrich people's understanding of what we do publicly and stuff, to include people from outside. So I see that in this series. Trying to think what else. I just I'm really proud of it. Yeah.
Me too. Yeah. I'm really enjoying it, and I think having not co-edited with you before, and going through this process, one of the things that has been really striking to me, and I think it's interesting that you mention it in this way, that's kind of like, oh, this is sort of a newer development with NiCHE, but it's a like quite international series. And like, I think that's very exciting, and I'm really glad that NiCHE makes that kind of space possible, because I don't think it's very when I'm thinking about easily accessible scholarship that's open online, I don't really know that there's much of that sort of international support, or the support for a variation like that. So considering that we received so many proposals, what do you think the future direction of this topic is? Like, can you see us continuing to work together to do more in emotional ecologies? Like, what do you think?
Oh, goodness. I feel like I'm not well versed enough yet in the literature to really make I don't think editing this blog series makes me like an expert on it. So I feel like I don't know exactly but one thing is for sure, people are into it. Like our call for papers is like the second most read post of the year. Like it got to the thousands of people, thousands, saw this call. And I mean, and you know, not 1,000 people submitted, thank goodness. But but there's just like there's an excitement around the topic. And that's something I noticed with when I do the queer succession, queering the environment series as well. Massive excitement around this topic. And like, to me, that says that we need to do more. Like it needs more space, and people want the space. Both people who are scholars and writers, because we also have some writers who aren't scholars. I want to add that we aren't only academic.
Yes. Yes.
And I think that's also something that NiCHE does that is cool. Like we don't gatekeep. That's our big thing. We don't gatekeep.
Yeah.
And secondly, the readership just like is really interested in this topic, and I think that makes sense. As we noted in our our introduction, ideas around eco-anxiety, etc., are really high, and it's on people's minds. And so to me, that means that we could easily do a follow-up to this. I've got succession queering the environment on a biannual schedule, so we could do like emotional ecologies on the opposite.
We will scheme. We will scheme. Yes. No, that sounds great.
But that's my main thing, is that I think this has momentum, and you can see things that have momentum when you publish publicly. Because you see what drives traffic, you see what people are Googling and how they're getting to you. You see and so I think this topic has momentum, and that means that it deserves more traditional academic scholarship, and it deserves more public scholarship and rating. So that would be my main takeaway.
Good to know. I love to have a little inside view in the brilliant editor's mind with that. So that's exciting. And thank you so much for suggesting that we have this live as well. It's been really good to kind of like, as a practice, kind of like take a moment to reflect halfway through, to just be thinking, okay, what have we done? Like, what's informed this? And even just thinking about, like, I have not at this time really sat and thought about what my kind of like genealogy of affect theory or history of emotions, what that is. So the opportunity to reflect on it has been really, and I feel like part of what I enjoy about it is that looking back on it, I can see in part the sort of threads of like, queer emotional ecologies, like why that those particular pieces feel really exciting to me, just with my own background. So, but I think I am among many who would say thank you very, very much, NiCHE, and thank you very much, Dr. DeWitt, for your work editing and also organizing these sorts of conversations. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Sarah. I appreciate you. And I'm glad that we're friends and like scholars, and it's fun to work with you.
It's so much fun to work with you, and I won't encourage listeners or viewers right now to pitch their ideas to you, because it's a lot of work on your end. But you never know. She is receptive.
I technically have 23 editors working for me. So
there you go.
Editorial team, and we are always accepting pitches, on any topic related to the environment, and we are here for you.
Yay.
Okay, I'm going to wrap it up. It was nice talking to you.
Okay. Nice talking to you.
Bye.
Bye.